I am pretty shy, especially in front of the camera. You should see how much I fretted just to do this little video, and Ian's so patient with me.
And I just sat there ready.
He's ready to go.
Take me as I am.
There's a certain kind of television that doesn't need a countdown clock or a screaming client to hold your attention. It just needs one man, one pile of scrap metal, and the willingness to let the camera watch him think. That was Ian Roussel. For nearly a decade, he was the quiet center of one of the strangest, most respected shows in automotive television. A guy who built masterpieces out of junk, alone, in the middle of the desert, without a single blueprint in sight. And then, without much noise or fanfare, he stepped away from the format that made him famous. No scandal, no cancellation headline, no dramatic farewell special. Just a slow fade from network schedules and a quiet reemergence somewhere else entirely. So what actually happened to Ian Roussel? Not the version dressed up for clicks, the real one. Let's get into it. Ian Roussel was born on November 19, 1970, and grew up in Sunland, a quiet corner of Southern California tucked against the foothills. From early on, it was obvious that traditional schooling wasn't where his mind lived. Some kids are wired for lecture halls and textbooks. Ian was wired for a workbench. While his classmates were sitting through algebra, he was somewhere else entirely. Hands on metal, figuring out how things fit together by simply taking them apart and putting them back a different way. He never went through a trade school. He never apprenticed under a famous name. There was no mentor handing him a roadmap. What he had instead was raw persistence, the willingness to keep building, keep failing, keep adjusting, until the work itself started speaking for him. That's a harder path than it sounds. Most people who try to teach themselves a craft this technical hit a wall and quietly give up. Ian didn't. He kept going long enough that, by his early 20s, he had already launched his own custom car operation, working out of a modest shop in the Mojave Desert, the same stretch of California high desert that would later define both his aesthetic and his television identity. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from learning a craft this way, through trial, failure, and stubborn repetition, rather than the curriculum somebody else designed. People who go through a formal apprenticeship absorb a set of rules about how things are supposed to be done. Ian never had that filter installed. He built his understanding of metal, structure, and design from direct experience alone, which meant his instincts developed without the usual guardrails. That's part of why his finished work so often looked like nothing else on the road. He wasn't unconsciously copying a style he'd been trained in, because he'd never been trained in one. What set him apart wasn't just talent. It was his refusal to work like everyone else in the business. No CAD software, no pre-drawn plans pinned to the wall, no design consultations mapping out every angle before a single cut was made. Ian would look at a car, often something that had already been left for dead by everyone else, and let an idea take shape in his head before he ever picked up a torch. It's a method that leaves almost no room for hiding mistakes, because there's no blueprint to blame when something doesn't work. Every decision was his, made in real time, under pressure, with nothing but instinct and 2 decades of accumulated hands-on knowledge. By the time most custom builders are still finding their footing, Ian had already spent years perfecting a style nobody else was working in. He wasn't chasing trends. He wasn't trying to replicate the polished, magazine cover look that dominated the custom car world. He was interested in something more elemental, shape, form, and what happens when you strip away every expectation of what a car is supposed to look like and let the metal become whatever it wants to be. He's talked about this in interviews, with a kind of bluntness that cuts through the usual car show mythology. Speaking to a reporter years into the show's run, he summed up his relationship to the work in one memorable line: "It's my addiction making them and creating all of these shapes." Not a hobby, not a business he happened to be good at. An addiction, in his own words, the compulsive need to keep transforming raw material into something new. Part of what made his process so distinct was the atmosphere around it. He wasn't running a slick operation with a sound system playing whatever was popular that year. He worked to Ministry and the Dead Milkmen, heavy, abrasive, distinctly punk rock music blasting through a desert workshop while he cut and welded. He's described himself as kind of a punk rock guy. And it fit. There was nothing manufactured about that identity. It was simply who he was, on camera and off. and it gave his corner of automotive television a texture nothing else on the dial had. He wasn't building in total isolation either. His wife, Jamie, has appeared alongside him across the show's run, and by all public accounts, she became an essential part of how the operation actually functioned, handling the pieces of the business that let Ian stay locked into the physical work. A one-man creative vision still needs infrastructure behind it, and that infrastructure was a partnership, even when the show's format put Ian alone in frame. That arrangement is worth pausing on, because it explained a lot about how a self-taught builder in the middle of the desert managed to sustain a genuine business, rather than just a hobby that occasionally sold a car. Fabrication is only half of what it takes to run an operation like this. Somebody has to handle client communication, manage the logistics of getting a finished vehicle from a Mojave garage to a buyer thousands of miles away, and keep the whole thing organized enough to function season after season. Jamie's role in that side of things gave Ian the freedom to stay almost entirely inside the creative and technical work, which is a luxury very few independent builders ever actually get. Full Custom Garage premiered on MAVTV in the spring of 2014, and it landed at a moment when automotive reality television had settled into a very specific, very tired formula. Ticking countdown clocks, clients storming into the shop with impossible demands, builders staging confrontations for the cameras, big crews dressed up to look like scrappy underdog operations. It was a genre that had figured out its tricks and was running them on repeat, and audiences had learned to expect the same manufactured tension, episode after episode. Ian Roussel's show did almost none of that. There was no crew standing behind him feeding him instructions, no fabricated deadline pressure, no dramatic reveal built around a client's manufactured disappointment turning into manufactured joy. Instead, viewers got exactly what was actually happening. One man, working alone in a modest Mojave shop, taking cars and trucks that most people would have written off as scrap and turning them into something nobody had seen before. He talked through his choices as he made them. When something didn't work, he said so, adjusted, and kept moving, not as a scripted beat, but because that's simply how the work goes when nobody's cleaning it up for you afterward. That honesty became the entire appeal. Automotive forums picked up on it almost immediately after the show launched, with viewers pointing out exactly what made it different. No fights, no bleeped arguments, no artificial deadline forcing a rushed finish by a certain hour. Just a builder actually building, narrating his reasoning as he cut and welded, treating the audience like people who wanted to understand the craft rather than be entertained by manufactured chaos. It read less like reality television and more like an apprenticeship you happen to be allowed to watch from a couch. The comparison people kept reaching for said a lot about where Full Custom Garage actually sat in the genre. Viewers and reviewers routinely set it apart from shows like Overhaulin', built around Chip Fusa's polished restoration work, or Kindigit Design, with its pristine facility and large specialized crew. Those shows had their own appeal, but they operated on a completely different scale. Big teams, dedicated paint booths, rows of expensive equipment. Full Custom Garage was the opposite of all that by design. One guy, one car, one modest garage, using classical hand techniques instead of a small army of specialists. That grassroots scale wasn't a limitation the show worked around. It was the entire point. Episode after episode leaned into that same stripped-down premise. Ian would take something most people had already given up on, a rusted 1931 Ford Jalopy, a beat-up 1955 Oldsmobile, an old 1949 International milk truck, a stock Volkswagen Bug, and rebuild it into something unrecognizable, using little more than what he already had lying around the shop. There was no pretense that any of it was easy. You watched him second-guess a cut, adjust a panel that wasn't sitting right, occasionally scrap an idea partway through, and start over. That willingness to let viewers see the false starts, rather than editing them into a smooth highlight reel, is exactly what separated the show from almost everything else airing in the same time slot. The response backed that up. Full Custom Garage built a loyal, almost studious audience, the kind of viewers who rewound sequences to understand exactly how a particular curve or panel came together, rather than just watching for the next dramatic beat. On IMDb, the show holds an unusually strong 8.7 out of 10, a rating that reflects genuine audience affection rather than casual channel surfing approval. That's a remarkable number for a show with essentially no manufactured drama to lean on. Proof that craftsmanship, presented honestly, can carry a television format all on its own. What started as a modest MAVTV series turned into one of the longer-running shows in its niche, eventually stretching across 9 seasons. That kind of longevity doesn't happen by accident in a crowded television landscape, and it says something specific about how deeply the show connected with the people who found it. The appeal reached well beyond casual car fans. Builders and fabricators pointed to full custom garage as validation that the old-school way of doing things, no software, no shortcuts, just skill and patience, still mattered. Some of Ian's finished builds ended up leaving the country entirely, purchased by collectors overseas. Vehicles he built in that small desert shop were boxed up and shipped to buyers in Japan, Germany, and the Netherlands, people who had discovered his work through the show and wanted a piece of it for themselves, sight unseen, based purely on trust in his craftsmanship. That's an extraordinary level of confidence to build from a television audience, and it speaks to how personal his connection with viewers actually became. Behind the scenes, Jamie's role kept expanding right alongside the show's growth. What the cameras framed as one man working solo was, in practice, a 2-person operation. Ian handling the fabrication, Jamie handling the business and production side that made it possible for that fabrication to reach an audience at all. It's a common pattern in creator-driven work. The public sees the craft, not the logistics holding the craft together. Longtime fans of the show often describe it less as entertainment they consumed and more as something they genuinely studied, pausing sequences, discussing technique in forum threads, showing up to car shows specifically hoping to catch Ian in person. That's the kind of audience relationship most shows never manage to build, and it's a big part of why Full Custom Garage still gets talked about years into its run, long after flashier competitors have come and gone. Some of his individual builds took on lives of their own, well beyond the episodes that introduced them. Space Junkie 2.0, one of his more talked-about creations, eventually landed at a Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale, Arizona, a serious stage for any custom vehicle to appear on. A radical custom T-Bird he built was later put on display at the Starbird Show, another marquee stop on the traditional hot rod circuit. Those aren't casual hobbyist showcases. They're the kind of venues where builders with decades of reputation behind them get invited to appear, and Ian's work kept earning him a seat at that table again and again. He also showed up in person more than most television builders bother to. In the summer of 2021, he appeared at the Spoken Speed and Custom Show in Washington State, spending 2 full days meeting fans and talking through his process in front of a room full of people who already knew his work inside and out. He's made appearances on enthusiast podcasts as well, including a long conversation on Let's Talk Dubs, a show built around classic Volkswagen culture, where he talked through his background as a fabricator and his approach to building. None of that reads like a man protecting a carefully managed public image. It reads like someone who genuinely likes being around people who care about the same things he does. Here's the piece of this story that rarely gets said out loud because it doesn't make for a dramatic headline. The conditions Ian actually worked in were genuinely brutal, in a way that had nothing to do with manufactured television tension. The Mojave Desert isn't a gentle place to run a metal shop. Summer temperatures out there routinely climb past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes well past it. And that's before you factor in what happens when you add a welding torch, a grinder throwing sparks, and a metal-roofed building soaking up sun for hours on end. Anyone who's spent real time doing physical labor in that kind of heat knows it isn't a background detail. It shapes every hour of the day, dictates how much you can realistically get done, and takes a toll that doesn't show up on camera the way a finished custom build does. That's the part of the show's authenticity that's easy to overlook. It's easy to admire the honesty of watching someone actually build something, without stopping to think about what it costs a person to do that kind of physical, technical work for hours at a stretch, day after day, season after season, in a climate that offers no mercy. Television that refuses to fake anything also refuses to fake the difficulty. And Ian Roussel's version of authenticity meant absorbing the real physical weight of the work instead of letting a crew or a controlled studio environment soften it for him. It's worth sitting with that, honestly, rather than turning it into something more sensational than it needs to be. Nothing about doing hard, skilled, Physical work for years in extreme conditions requires an invented medical emergency to be worth respecting. The demand of the work itself, consistently, for the better part of a decade, is the real story. And it's a story about discipline and endurance, not catastrophe. At some point, after years of operating inside a network's production schedule, Ian made a shift. Rather than continuing indefinitely within the constraints of traditional television, fixed episode lengths, broadcast windows, the editorial choices that come with handing your footage over to someone else's cutting room, he moved toward a format that let him control the pace and shape of his own content directly. That shift shows up clearly in Full Custom Ian, his own YouTube channel, where he now posts builds without the constraints that come with a network schedule. The channel describes itself plainly: dedicated to genuine custom car builds and hand-built fabrication, created without CAD design, bolt-on parts, or modern shortcuts. The same philosophy that defined his television work, just without anyone else's hand on the edit. Episodes run whatever length the actual build demands rather than a fixed broadcast slot, which means viewers get to see the full arc of a project instead of a version trimmed down to fit a time block. The channel's own description places Ian's fabrication work in a lineage that matters to people who actually follow the custom car world, naming influences like Gene Winfield, Ed Big Daddy Roth, and George Barris, legendary figures in traditional hot rod and custom car culture. That's not a small claim. Being spoken of in that company means something to an audience that takes this craft seriously, and it signals that Ian sees his own work as a continuation of a much older tradition rather than a television gimmick that happened to catch on. The audience followed him. His Instagram account at full_custom_Ian has built a following well past 170,000, and his public pages show an engaged, steady community rather than a fan base that faded once the show left broadcast television. Fans who discovered him years earlier on MAVTV described finding the YouTube content as something closer to the real, unfiltered version of what they'd always been watching. The same builder, the same instincts, just without a network's fingerprints on the final product. Jamie has remained a visible part of the channel as well, continuing the same partnership that powered the television years, though, like any creative operation run by real people rather than a corporate structure, the exact shape of a role has continued to shift and evolve over time, something the two of them have addressed directly and openly with their audience, rather than leaving to speculation. That kind of openness has become one of the defining traits of the YouTube era of Ian's career. On television, the format dictated what got shown and what got left on the cutting room floor. On his own channel, he and Jamie get to decide that themselves, which means viewers get updates on shop changes, project setbacks, and behind-the-scenes decisions that a network edit would almost certainly have trimmed out for pacing. It's a small shift in control, but it's exactly the kind of shift that explains why so many longtime fans describe the channel as the more honest version of something they already loved. What's clear, watching Ian Roussel's trajectory rather than guessing at it, is that he never actually stopped. The version of the story that frames this as some kind of downfall misses the far more interesting reality. A craftsman who built his reputation on one platform and then, deliberately, moved that reputation somewhere he had more control over the outcome. He continues to build. Recent updates from his own channel show him working on new projects, including custom Volkswagen builds and other one-off creations that carry the same handmade, no shortcuts philosophy that made Full Custom Garage worth watching in the first place. He's continued making appearances at major car show circuits, the kind of events where the audience is made up of people who actually understand and care about the craft, not passive channel surfers. That's the environment Ian has always seemed most at home in, standing next to the work itself, talking through how it came together, rather than performing for a camera crew chasing a manufactured storyline. There have also been indications, through his own channel updates, that his working setup has shifted geographically over time, the kind of practical change that happens naturally as a person's business and life evolve, not evidence of some larger unraveling. Shops change. Leases end. Builders relocate for space, for cost, for 100 practical reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's career falling apart. Framing a shop move as some kind of collapse says more about the appetite for manufactured drama than it does about anything Ian Roussel has actually said or done. None of that undercuts the through line of his career. If anything, it reinforces it. This is someone who has consistently prioritized doing the actual work over managing a public image, and who has adapted his platform, his location, and his format as needed while keeping the core of what he does completely intact. So let's be honest about what this story really is. Instead of dressing it up as something it isn't, there was no dramatic collapse, no manufactured catastrophe. What there was, instead, is a genuinely demanding decade of skilled physical labor, performed largely alone, in one of the harshest working environments in the country, by a man who never once treated the difficulty of that work as something to complain about on camera. 9 seasons of a show that refused to fake anything. An 8.7 rating built entirely on craftsmanship, rather than manufactured drama. Billed shipped to collectors across 3 different continents, because people trusted the work enough to buy it without ever seeing it in person. A television career that ended not with a cancellation notice, but with a deliberate choice to move the work somewhere he had more control over it. And now, a YouTube channel that's thriving specifically because it's more honest than the format that came before it. Longer, unpolished, unmistakably his. That's not the shape of a tragedy. That's the shape of a craftsman who understood, better than most people in his position ever do, exactly when and how to build his own next chapter instead of waiting for someone else to write it for him. It's worth stepping back and thinking about what actually made Ian Roussel worth watching in the first place, because it's easy to lose sight of it underneath headlines built to sound dramatic. It was never really about the finished cars, impressive as they were. It was about watching a genuinely self-taught craftsman solve problems in real time, with no safety net, no committee of specialists to lean on, and no script telling him what to say when something went wrong. That's a rare thing to put on camera honestly, and rarer still to sustain across 9 full seasons without the format ever curdling into the same manufactured drama that swallowed most of its competitors. The custom car world doesn't forget builders like that. Long after a given season stops airing anywhere, the people who actually work with their hands, welders, fabricators, hobbyists rebuilding something in their own garage on the weekend, keep referencing shows like this one as proof that you don't need a massive facility or a television budget to make something worth admiring. You need patience, a willingness to fail in front of people, and enough stubbornness to keep going anyway. Ian Roussel built an entire career, and now a second act, out of exactly that combination. He told a reporter once that it isn't really about the cars for him. It's the addiction to making them, to creating shapes that didn't exist before he picked up the torch. That addiction is clearly still running. Everything else, the network, the schedule, the broadcast window, was never the point. It was just the container the work happened to live in for a while, before he built himself a better one. Whatever comes next for Ian Roussel, one thing seems safe to say. It'll happen on his own terms, at his own pace, and it'll almost certainly involve a torch, a pile of raw material, and a plan that exists nowhere except inside his own head. That's been the constant through every version of this career, from the earliest days in a Southern California garage to 9 seasons of network television to whatever new build is currently taking shape in his shop right now. The platform changes. The instinct doesn't. If you want to see where that addiction has taken him lately, Full Custom Ian on YouTube is the place to look. Watch a full build from start to finish, and you'll understand within the first 15 minutes exactly why people have been paying attention to this guy since 2014. Been watching since the MAVTV days? Let us know your favorite build in the comments. We read every one. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.